All right, the landscape painting tip that you need is to organize your scene into different levels of distance. If you get intimidated by painting the trees or rocks in this landscape, and if you think that your painting would end up more like this rather than this, then you are really going to enjoy this video. You see, being able to organize your scene into different levels of distance is going to make painting things like these trees and these rocks a whole lot easier. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is when you're painting a landscape from a photo, you really need to let go of the idea of trying to copy the photo exactly. You know, I was almost going to title this video, Why Your Landscape Painting Should Not Look Like the Photo. If you're always just trying to make it look exactly like the photo, you're going to get led down a bad path and things are just going to be a whole lot more difficult. I would say painting landscapes is about translating what you see, not copying what you see. So just have that in mind as we move forward. Now, when it comes to these trees, I don't like to think of them as individual trees or leaves or branches or anything. I try and think of them as cardboard cutouts that have been placed at the edge of this stream going back into the distance. Because thinking about them like cardboard cutouts is going to make it a lot easier to implement atmospheric perspective. Now, atmospheric perspective consists of 4 different things. There's colors, there's values, there's edges, and there's simplicity. See, with colors, as you get further in the distance, certain colors drop out. First yellows, then reds, and you're left with blues. So the trees in the distance are going to be a lot cooler. They're not going to be as saturated as the trees are in the foreground. You know, same thing goes with values, or more specifically value relationships, meaning the darks and the lights in the foreground are going to be of much higher contrast than the darks and lights in the background. A lot of people get tripped up on this when working from photos because a lot of times photos can be very misleading because a lot of times these shadows in the distance in photos are just as dark and have just as much contrast as things in the foreground. So you got to remind yourself, it's not about painting what the camera sees, it's about what painting the eye sees. And you need to be able to change things. You need to be able to have less contrast in the trees in the distance. Now with edges, the trees in the distance are going to have a lot more soft edges. Almost think about them as if they're out of focus or fuzzy. They need to sit in the distance. If you use a lot of hard, crisp edges, that's going to bring things forward. So you want to save that for the things up front. You know, I made sure to make things more crisp here in the foreground and keep things more soft and fuzzy in the background. And the last thing is simplicity. You know, I'm going to paint things in the distance a lot more simple than I would in the front. You know, I'm saving detail for the foreground. You know, I'm not going to worry about thoroughly painting things way in the distance. Like I want to try and get them to be painted as simply as I can. And all this stuff goes for the rocks as well. The further back into the distance I go, the less rocks I identify. I only paint individual rocks in the foreground. Now, once I start painting, I draw out these shapes of these organized trees stepping back into the distance. And most of the time when I'm painting a landscape that has a lot of distance in it, like you can see far away, I like to start with the furthest element in the scene and work my way forward. So that's what I did here. I started with the sky, I moved to the mountain, and then moved to the trees in front of the mountain, and just worked my way forward. I like doing this because I can compare the next level that I'm doing with the level that I did previous behind it. And I can make sure that their relationship in terms of color and value are working to create distance, and I just kind of inch my way forward. Now, I'm blocking out this whole painting with big shapes of flat color. And right now these trees do look like cardboard cutouts, but since I am implementing atmospheric perspective even in this beginning stage, the distance is being portrayed, and the trees in the distance are sitting behind the trees in the foreground. And you can see I'm establishing the trees in the foreground as much darker than the trees in the background. Remember, the darks are going to be darker in the foreground than the background. Now, once I block in all these big flat shapes, I'm just going to move back to my furthest element in the scene again and work my way forward, adding in smaller shapes and finessing edges. And at this point, I really take the time to soften the trees in the distance, soften these edges, make them fuzzy and almost out of focus. This softer look is going to help them sit in the distance and separate them from the trees in the foreground. And you can see once I start painting these trees that are closer up, I'm using a lot more brush strokes. I'm using more shapes and smaller shapes to communicate the clusters of leaves on the branches. Now, since these trees started out very blocky, I'm gonna have to go in and cut out negative shapes from it. I always find it helpful to block out trees blockier and kind of more full of leaves, and then go and cut back as much as I want. And when I'm doing this cutting back process, I'm making sure to soften the edges, like in these holes or these areas that I cut out, to help them read more like leaves. If I leave the holes that I cut back too crisp and cut out looking, it's just not gonna really read as leaves. So I'm going to make sure to utilize soft edges in these leaves. All right, now for the rocks, the first thing I do is I establish distance with the rocks with the shapes. And I do that by having fewer bigger shapes in the distance and more smaller fragmented shapes in the foreground. You can see things start out pretty simple and connected in the distance, and as you move forward, those shapes get fragmented and you start to be able to identify more specific rocks. Now, I only put the darkest dark of the cracks and crevices in the rocks in the foreground. You see, I don't use any of those in the background. Now, a little side note here, when it comes to painting rocks, I feel like I can break them down into pretty much 3 basic values. There's just the basic value of the rock in general, and then there's the darkest dark, which is a lot of times like the cracks at the base of the rock or between rocks. And then there's the top planes of the rock getting the most light. Now for this painting, the rocks are in shadow, so the light that they're getting is just ambient reflected light coming down from the sky, which is pretty cool, but it's still going to be lighter. So knowing those 3 values and kind of how they operate on the planes of the rock makes it very easy for me to just make up rocks of different shapes and sizes. Now, by no means I'm going through the painting like rock by rock and trying to make it look exactly the way it is. I might see certain rocks that I like and I make it look like that rock, but I don't need to. But just being able to make up rocks because kind of like the formula of the light pattern is gonna make things a lot easier. All right, now that you've gone through this lesson, you can see how I used everything that I've talked about in this video on this painting right here. It's actually an even more dramatic change from the photo to the painting. But you can see how I established many different levels of distance. And those distance levels dictated how I painted certain things in the scene. For example, this tree in the foreground has much darker darks than this set of trees behind it. Or just the fact that any of the greens in the trees progressively get cooler the further back in space you get. And you can see even way in the distance, they're practically just almost blue. There's just absolutely no way I could have gone about painting this without establishing different levels of distance. All right, now if you're really into landscape painting and you want to keep the learning going and you want a deep dive into my landscape painting process, I highly suggest checking out this video here. I'm Chris Fornatero, here telling you to go get painting.